Tonight, we begin with a military operation long planned by American officials that silenced intelligence analysts for a moment. 30 minutes that shattered diplomatic restraint between Washington and Caracas. 30 minutes that forced the world to confront what most had hoped would remain theoretical. The U.S. military, under the direct authorization of President Trump, launched attacks against Venezuela, driving President Nicolás Maduro and his wife out of Venezuelan territory. As Delta Force operators flew over Caracas before dawn, hemispheric security fundamentally changed. The response from Caracas was not a challenge. It was silence. For weeks, there were signs. Not through diplomatic channels, but through patterns that suddenly disappeared. The Trump administration was methodical. Attacks on drug ships, naval blockades against tankers, bombardment flights off the Venezuelan coast. Every action followed a recognizable logic. But what put the Pentagon on high alert in the last 72 hours was the disappearance of the pattern. Intelligence detected unusual movements. Special operations helicopters were redeployed to the Caribbean. The USS Iwo Jima was deployed to locations that would only make sense in case something imminent happened. All of this happened without the usual pre-operation talk. The silence was operational. And when Washington remains silent like this, something unprecedented happened. At 2 a.m. local time, infrared systems reportedly recorded multiple signals across northern Venezuela. Coordinated explosions targeting specific objectives were carried out within a compressed time frame. The explosion struck Miranda Air Base, Fort Tuna in Caracas, La Carlota Airport, the Higrote facility, and the port of La Guaira. These were the eyes and ears of Venezuela's defense apparatus. And they were struck simultaneously and effectively, preventing commanders from understanding what was happening. The attacks lasted well under 30 minutes, but preparations took months. Cruise missiles launched from Caribbean naval platforms flew low, close to the water, then headed towards land on calculated trajectories. Venezuelan radar operators, struggling for hours with electronic jamming that disrupted their systems, were unable to form a coherent picture. Contacts appeared, disappeared, and reappeared in illogical locations. By the time teams understood the attack situation, the first wave had already reached its targets. Command centers lost contact, air defenses were disabled, communications broke down, integrated defenses crumbled within minutes. Speed was the weapon that hampered the response in the time frame Delta Force was carrying out its primary mission. To understand how this operation was conducted, I suggest you examine the 48 hours preceding the attacks, because tension began 2 days earlier when a B-1B Lancer bomber was conducting a routine patrol in international airspace. 2 Venezuelan fighter jets rapidly approached from the coast, approaching with aggressive intent. The distance dropped from 40 miles to 30 miles in seconds. There was no radio communication. Inside the bomber, active radar lock-on was being recorded. The Venezuelan pilots were targeting at this distance. The situation was seconds away from becoming irreversible. What the Venezuelan pilots didn't realize was this: they weren't engaging a lone bomber. High above, beyond radar coverage, were American escort aircraft. Electronic warfare systems were jamming the information the Venezuelan pilots were receiving. Ranges appeared inaccurate. Angles didn't even match training expectations. Yet the jets moved closer. 20 miles, 15 miles. Their emissions painted clear pictures for every American element following. What began as a show of resolve actually became a major intelligence game. Every second locked onto the target revealed operational patterns, reaction times, and signature. They believed they were demonstrating strength. They exposed weaknesses. We saw the tension de-escalate as quickly as it built. Venezuelan fighter jets changed course, maintaining distance. American bombers continued their patrol. No missiles were fired, but the threshold was tested. What the planners learned directly impacted what happened 36 hours later. Intelligence characterized the interception as Venezuela's final test of readiness. Reconnaissance, militarily aggressive but predictable, capable but uncoordinated, willing to exert pressure but unsure how far to go. When you fully understand the enemy's limitations, you design operations that exploit every gap. Here, the narrative becomes far more significant. While attention was focused on the Caracas bombings, another dimension hidden beneath the surface was noticed. A submarine had been positioned in deep waters for hours. This wasn't a reactive deployment. It had been there weeks in advance, planned and waiting for the right opportunity. When the airstrikes began, the mission parameters shifted from monitoring to execution. Cruise missiles, after months of surveillance, surfaced one after another, skimming the surface towards predetermined coastal targets, not the already burning high-profile facilities, but the supporting infrastructure. East Coast radar provided early warning, command centers coordinating naval operations. Communication relays connecting units, facilities were plunged into darkness one by one. In the coastal command centers, confusion descended into paralysis. Screens malfunctioned, ranging from partially functioning to completely gone. Some screens displayed meaningless traces. Others froze. Telephone calls to neighboring facilities went unanswered. The unfolding spread, not just the Caracas attack, a systematic collapse of the entire defense infrastructure. The electrical grids collapsed in a chain reaction and became inoperable. Facilities built over years were brought down in minutes. Emergency crews found roads blocked and closed, communication constantly interrupted, and coordination impossible. All areas operated in darkness until sunrise. They weren't destroyed. They were disrupted. Because disruption is often more effective. When systems collapse in layers, the decision-making mechanism collapses too. They attacked Venezuela's ability to analyze and understand, to communicate, to gather intelligence, and to coordinate its response. By targeting infrastructure, they transformed individual entities into an integrated system. They did this while Delta Force implemented its primary objective in Caracas. The airstrikes weren't the operation itself. The airstrikes were merely cover, creating chaos that allowed a small operational team to infiltrate one of the most secure locations in the hemisphere, rescue a head of state, and evacuate without encountering sustained resistance. By the time Venezuelan authorities understood the full extent of the situation, Maduro and his wife were already in the air, outside Venezuelan airspace, under American surveillance. This was thanks to a very swift and detailed plan. Tonight's events and developments didn't happen overnight. They were the culmination of a pressure campaign that began in August and has continued ever since. Operation Southern Spear, planned in November, evolved from a drug trafficking campaign into a hybrid operation. From September onwards, forces attacked ships allegedly carrying drugs in the Caribbean and Pacific. 35 boats were destroyed. 115 people were killed. Venezuelan authorities called it piracy. The Americans called it law enforcement. There was a deliberate legal ambiguity. In December, the pressure intensified. A CIA drone attacked a port facility, the first known direct attack inside Venezuela. Trump increased the reward for Maduro from $25 million to $50 million. Cartel de los Soles was declared a foreign terrorist organization, providing legal justification for targeting Venezuelan officials. By the end of December, planning progressed. Military officials discussed an execution by Christmas, but ISIS attacks in Nigeria took precedence. Weather conditions delayed the attempts. The operation was delayed, refined, and finally implemented when conditions were right. The buildup in the Caribbean was the largest American presence since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Gerald Ford Aircraft Carrier Group, the Iwo Jima Amphibious Group, and numerous support ships. Trump described it as the largest naval deployment in South American history. B-52 bombers conducted demonstration flights miles offshore. MQ-9 drones provided constant surveillance. The message was clear and unambiguous. Trump wanted Maduro gone. What was uncertain, diplomatic pressure economic strangulation, or military intervention? The answer was given within half an hour, and the Delta Force deployment was clear. A direct military operation to remove the incumbent head of state from his capital. What highlights its significance is the context. Trump authorized the operation. When Delta Force arrived, Maduro was not in a strong and effective position. Despite his public defiance, his mobilization of forces, and his declaration of a state of emergency, intelligence indicated that the leader was under considerable pressure. Military groups wanted victories. Economic advisors were grappling with sanctions and collapsing oil revenues. Security services were becoming increasingly concerned about stability as shortages intensified. The political coalition was crumbling under American pressure. Russia and Iran offered rhetoric but limited support. Cuba, being economically struggling, offered little beyond solidarity. Intelligence assessments showed that the leader understood that time was working against him. The aggressive bomber blockade, the public defiance, the mobilization of forces, all reflected a power he didn't possess. When leaders in this position make sudden moves, they rarely act with self-confidence. They act out of desperation, demonstrating control at a moment when it's slipping away. But American planners understood this. They saw the aggressive stance as evidence of weakness. They designed the operation to take full advantage of this. The decision to attack wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. Trump had been threatening for months. The infrastructure was in place. The intelligence was up to date. Legal grounds were established with terrorist designation. Trump gave final approval days in advance, allowing the commanders to choose the most opportune tactical timeframe. The timing is no coincidence. Maduro has been accused of drug terrorism since the bounty has been publicly available for years. What has changed is not the legal framework, but the willingness to act accordingly. This reflects a broader shift in the Trump administration's approach to security threats across the hemisphere. Traditional tools have been tried. All have failed to achieve the goal of removing Maduro. Tonight represents a fundamental readjustment. If diplomatic pressure cannot eliminate the designated drug terrorist leader, if sanctions cannot bring about a change in behavior, then military action becomes a logical extension. This logic, however controversial, guided the operation that resulted in Maduro's capture. International reaction has been swift and divided along ideological lines. Argentina's Milei celebrated the situation. Freedom is advancing. The overthrow of Maduro signifies the validation of the critique of authoritarian socialism. Cuba's Díaz-Canel condemned the criminal attack and called for international condemnation of state terrorism. Cuba's dependence on Venezuelan oil shows that the overthrow of Maduro is an existential concern. Russia also condemned the armed aggression, stating that the justifications were indefensible. Moscow's support for Maduro remains consistent but increasingly symbolic. Tonight's operation demonstrates the limits of its existence. Russia condemns protests but cannot reverse. Iran condemned the violation of sovereignty, but similarly limited itself to rhetoric. The statements are significant not as harbingers of concrete action, but as signs of diplomatic alignment. Colombia's reaction is more complex. Petro called for emergency meetings of the UN and OAS and announced the deployment of forces to the border in anticipation of a refugee influx. This reflects pragmatic concern about the security situation. If Venezuela descends into chaos, Colombia will face direct consequences. The carefully crafted statement condemned the American action without attacking Trump, called for dialogue without defending Maduro, and positioned Colombia as a concerned neighbor. Boric from Chile expressed his concern, emphasizing adherence to international law, the prohibition of the use of force, and the principle of non-intervention. In fact, we see that it reflected the unease felt by many Latin American governments regarding American regional military action. Historical memories of Cold War intervention shape reactions. Even governments that privately welcome the removal of their governments must publicly reaffirm the principles of sovereignty. The EU, through Callas, stated that the Maduro government lacks legitimacy, while calling for restraint and respect for international law. This formulation reflects a broader dilemma. Brussels has no fondness for Maduro, but it appears to have deep reservations about unilateral action that bypasses institutions. In fact, everyone can see that clearly. Intelligence analysts are evaluating scenarios. One possibility, Maduro is extradited to the United States, tried in the Southern District of New York, where the 2020 indictment is still valid, and subjected to an unprecedented trial. The current leader is not forcibly removed by a foreign military and faces American criminal charges. The legal and diplomatic consequences are profound. Some academics are debating and asking, is this a legitimate law enforcement action or a violation of sovereignty? The Trump administration, through Rubio, argues that Maduro is not a legitimate leader, but the leader of a drug trafficking terrorist organization. This characterization provides a framework that treats the operation as a law enforcement action, not regime change. Critics argue, regardless of terminology, that forcibly removing the incumbent president constitutes regime change. Vice President Rodriguez publicly stated that the government does not know Maduro's whereabouts and demanded proof that he is alive. In fact, this admission is very important. Even high-ranking officials did not provide any information about the location or situation after the operation. In the absence of clear leadership, groups can fill the void. Defense Minister Pedrino Lopez called for a large military deployment, insisting that Venezuela would not surrender. But it is unclear who is coordinating and under what authority. If groups seize control of different regions and the army disintegrates, Venezuela could descend into civil conflict. A third possibility is the planning of American officials, a controlled transition process coordinated with the opposition. Maria Corina Machado was in contact with Trump officials for months. Reports indicate that detailed plans exist for the first 100 hours after the impeachment. The restoration of democratic institutions, the restructuring of security, and the restart of oil production. Its feasibility depends on whether military and civilian institutions accept American-backed leadership or resist it as a foreign imposition. The opposition spokespersons declined to comment, a silence likely indicating coordination or ambiguity with Washington. What complicates the scenarios is the lack of clear information about Maduro's current situation. Trump announced the capture, but gave no details about the location or immediate step. A planned press conference could clarify the situation, but the information vacuum creates room for speculation. Venezuelan state media is largely silent. The opposition is celebrating but vague. International observers are demanding answers. In the midst of uncertainty, each group is calculating its position on what will happen next. The situation is extremely volatile. Variables that are stable this morning could change dramatically this afternoon. Let's look at what we know now. The American military intervention has fundamentally changed the course of the Venezuelan crisis. But what about what we don't know? What we don't know is, will the change lead to stability or to deeper chaos? This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of something yet to be understood. Tonight's operation was tactically precise and successful, and it raised questions that have shaped hemispheric security for years. The immediate tactical success is clear. Maduro's withdrawal without significant losses, without prolonged conflict, without the Pentagon's nightmare scenarios. What is uncertain is what will happen when the sun rises over Caracas without the president. What will happen when institutions organized around Maduro's authority for decades suddenly become decentralized? What will happen when military units accustomed to a specific chain see that chain broken? The Venezuelan government demanded proof that he is alive. This demand reveals a great deal. Even high-ranking officials who should have access to secure channel information have no confirmed information about Maduro's status or whereabouts. Such confusion is impossible in a functioning government. Its existence shows how deeply the operation has fragmented the leadership. When leadership is fragmented, when the absence of authority creates competing power centers, the results are rarely peaceful. We have seen a similar pattern before. After the invasion of Iraq, after Gaddafi in Libya, Syria, after the uprising. The removal of the authoritarian leader, however, justified, creates a vacuum that is extremely difficult to fill with stable governance. The United States has plans, officials are coordinating with the opposition, an economic restructuring plan has been drawn up. Diplomatic recognition is ready, but plans are not reality. The gap between the visionary planners in secure facilities and the reality on the streets of Caracas can be vast and unpredictable. Venezuela is not a small country. it is not an insignificant player. It possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves. Stability is crucial for global energy markets, regional migration, and the security calculations of neighboring states. What happens in the next 72 hours will reverberate across the hemisphere and beyond. The silence from Caracas tonight is profound. Not a silence of surrender, but a silence of calculation. Military commanders are weighing their options. Political groups are measuring their influence. Intelligence services are trying to understand what is happening, what it means for survival. In this silence, in the gap between what is and what will happen, the future of the entire country hangs in the balance. The real question is not what happened tonight. The real question is, after the United States removed Maduro from power by military force, will it be able to manage what happens next? Will the opposition be able to unite its groups and form a governing coalition? Will the military accept external guidance, or will it disintegrate? Will neighboring countries support or resist American intervention? Will institutions legitimize or condemn the precedent-setting practices? None of these questions have answers yet. Until they are found, Venezuela exists in deep uncertainty. The operation was carried out with precision. What remains is to see whether the precision in military operations will translate into stability in political outcomes. History shows that this gap is often wider than planners anticipate, because what happens in Caracas will reverberate across this hemisphere for years to come. Just stay tuned to stay informed about the events